I would like to continue my discussion of the grizzly bear today. And I want to pick up first looking at how they eat, basically the food cycle. So the grizzly bear has really been studied extensively in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Researchers know and biologists, zoologists know what they're going to eat, pretty much when they're going to eat it, and what the consequences are in terms of their population. And also in a way to manage and prevent human-bear interactions in. So when they come out of hibernation, basically what they'll try to take advantage of at that time is that there'll be a lot of winter kill. There'll be a lot of carrion left over from winter, so bison carcasses, elk carcasses, and so on, and they'll start off on that. And then following that, and actually part of that season would be the calving season. And so elk calves, potentially even bison calves, but particularly elk calves, they really go to town on the elk calves. So they'll basically wander through areas where the elk are pretty common, and they'll try to get the calves. They don't really feed on adult elk that much at this time of year, but they would certainly do so early. And if there were some diseased or really weak adults, they may be taking them down. But with the wolf reintroduction, the wolves are likely to get to them first. And then also during the cutthroat trout run, the females in particular will go after the cutthroat trout. Then as you move into midsummer, things begin to change a little bit. They'll still go after wolf kills, so they'll try to be stealing wolf kills whenever possible. Then they'll turn to a lot of small rodents. They go after gophers. They'll literally feed on gophers for hours. They also become more a vegetarian in their diet. They'll go after roots, grasses, berries, even flowers. And then also as cutworm moths come up from the plains, in the mid to late summer, then they'll also begin to move up into the talus fields and feed on the cutworm moths. And then as we move into late summer and fall, they'll continue to feed on the cutworm moths until they migrate back down to the plains. And then also they turn to white bark pine nuts, so basically in the cones. And so they move into white bark pine forests. And then also they may become very predatory again and start feeding on large prey. So, and I should also mention that they are somewhat more predatory when they first come out of hibernation as well. So that's more or less the cycle of the types of foods that they eat annually. Now, in terms of grizzly management, grizzlies and black bears both used to feed on dumps within the park, and there were very large numbers. And the dumps, and so managers wanted to return this to a natural ecosystem in the 1960s and into the 70s. And so the dumps were closed in 1970. As a result, these bears then didn't have anything to eat. Populations crashed, and they were listed as a threatened species in 1975. The population had recovered pretty well. The numbers were probably down to about 150 at one time. We think the numbers are more like 600 right now, and so they were delisted in 2007. And as I'll talk about in a minute, I think that was really a premature and bad decision, but nonetheless, they were delisted in 2007. So a grizzly management plan was instituted as part of that delisting process. It's an interagency process, again, involving National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and so on, as well as state agencies with Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And so in this management plan, what I also think is a big mistake is the state agencies have primary management responsibility. And to be honest with you, the state agencies just don't have the same kind of priorities as federal agencies. They're much more influenced by local control. But anyway, that's the way the management plan stands right now. Anyway, the goal is to maintain at least 500 grizzlies in the ecosystem, and it does emphasize removing human causes of conflicts, at least in language. In practice, it isn't really working out so much like that, but that's the idea. Also, there are certain monitors built into the system. So the total mortality of independent females is not to exceed 9% of the total, estimated total of the population. 2 successive years of that can trigger going back on the endangered species list. Total mortality of independent males cannot exceed 15%. That was exceeded this year. I think also the 9% limit was exceeded this year for the females. And again, that in 2 successive years, that would automatically trigger relisting. Human-caused dependent young mortality is not to exceed 9%. I'm not sure if that was met this year or not, but again, there was a lot of mortality this particular year and last year as well. And then a minimum of 48 females producing cubs is also a minimum requirement for the population. So we'll see what happens in the future, but I really do feel this was a premature listing for a lot of reasons. One of the big reasons and the major cause of mortality in the last year since they have been delisted, and this has been a problem in even before delisting, has been hunters. So, as we've talked about, there's an elk hunting season, and so what happens is that hunters will kill the elk, and part of that is that they'll gut the elk, and it creates what's called a gut pile. So they'll leave the gut pile behind, and they'll take the body and the head as a trophy. And anyway, that gut pile is food, and so what grizzlies have learned over time is that when they hear a gunshot, that's like a dinner bell. They know there's going to be a gut pile, so they come and run it. Anyway, that has led to a lot of interactions between hunters and grizzlies. And so the hunters are supposed to, basically give up their carcass if that's the case, or use bear spray. But especially since delisting, they're just shooting the grizzlies. And so there were just a number of shootings this year, much more than is typical. And that would just be in the reported shootings. There's no telling how many unreported shootings were going on. So this is really a major cause of mortality for the grizzly. In addition to that, as we've already talked about, there's a crashing cutthroat trout population, severely crashing cutthroat trout population, so that's typically a big food source. The whitebark pine forest will probably be gone in the decade. Another major source of food, especially going into hibernation, so that's, again, problematic, to say the least. There's also cattle and sheep ranching along the periphery of the ecosystem, and there actually has been, cattle, on public lands in the ecosystem, and there's a move to actually have that stopped as well. And so that creates and limits the ability of grizzlies to expand beyond their current territory, because they may eventually start predating on sheep or cattle if they're encountering them. So, so there is a movement to try to stop granting permission to run cattle in the national forest, for example. And I think in that particular ecosystem it would be a good thing, but a lot of people don't think like I do. Also, just development around the area creates human-bear interactions, and anytime you have human-bear interactions, that's going to lead to a dead bear. And then also, as I mentioned previously, the bear has really benefited from wolf reintroduction, and we're going to be talking about wolves in a few minutes. The wolf population is beginning to crash because they also have been delisted. So as the wolf population crashes, that's also going to impact food supply for bears, and we're going to have a bear crash that continues as well. So whether we're talking about black or grizzly bears, there is also one other thing I want to emphasize, and it is that if bears get food from humans, that's going to end up being a dead bear. That's going to lead to a more aggressive bear over time. It learns to associate food with the human. And so the saying up there is a fed bear is a dead bear. If you let them get food from you, eventually, even if they relocate that bear, it's eventually going to make its way back, and eventually it's going to have to be put down. So it's crucial to take care of your food and make sure that bears don't get your food when you're in that ecosystem. All right, so the other bear in the ecosystem, of course, is the black bear. And so the black bear, we have some video to show you here. The black bear can sometimes be confused with the grizzly bear, but there are some differences. So generally the profile of the face is much flatter. They don't have nearly as pronounced of a shoulder hump. We usually describe the rump being higher than the hump if there is a hump, so much a flatter profile. And again, the facial profile will be much flatter as well. Now this is a big black bear, and so it almost looks a little bit like a grizzly, but again, we see a much flatter profile on the back. We don't see the big, powerful hump and a flatter face, so that's a pretty good one. Also notice that even though this is a black bear, it was a brown black bear. And so that's another thing about black bears is you can see a lot of different color phases, everything from jet black, and I've seen them virtually blonde, almost white. So there's a tremendous variation in the coloration of black bears. And also in terms of size, grizzly bears are quite a bit bigger, so the largest males can get up to around 800 pounds. Generally with the largest of the black bears, you wouldn't be getting that much, maybe 600 pounds. But I have seen some very large male black bears which rival the size of grizzlies. And black bears also have been very successful in the ecosystem. They do a lot of the same things that grizzly bears do. They're better climbers. They don't dig as much. They're not as successful in going after gophers and roots and things like that. They're more likely to be going after berries and so on when they go for vegetation. They can't take as large a prey, for example, or they're not generally as successful. So they do butt heads a little bit. They generally seem to ignore one another, but there has been some evidence that some grizzlies will on occasion kill a black bear if they come face to face. But normally the black bears give way to the grizzly. Grizzlies are much more powerful. And if you should end up in a face-to-face encounter with black bears, and there have been attacks on people by black bears in the ecosystem, if you're attacked by a black bear, be aggressive, you fight for your life. If you're attacked by a black bear, in the case of a grizzly bear, you don't fight for your life. You play dead and hope for the best. The grizzlies are just too aggressive, too big, but you can sometimes get the black bears to lay off. But either situation, it would not be the best thing in the world. Okay, so looking at other members of the carnivora in the ecosystem, another family of carnivora would be the Canidae, the dogs. And so in the Yellowstone ecosystem, one member of the ecosystem is the red fox. And the red fox, as we'll talk about trophic cascade later, has actually benefited from reintroduction of the wolf, and we'll talk more about that down the line. But the red fox we find throughout the ecosystem, they're quite beautiful. There are a number of different color phases. You can see them from blackish to silverish to really brilliant red. And there's also a subspecies in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Genetic studies have shown that above 7,000 feet you find a kind of a lighter version of the red fox. It's kind of a yellowish fox. Sometimes people call it the yellow fox. And they don't mix much with the foxes below 7,000 feet. So there is a subspecies that we find in the ecosystem above 7,000 feet. Foxes have really big ears. They're very much auditory predators. This is similar to coyotes, so you'll see them not only visually hunting, but listening, and they'll listen for rustling of voles or mice in the grasses and in snow as well. And then they'll jump up and dive down and capture the prey. But generally they're going after small prey, around 12 pounds or so. 12 to 20 pounds, I guess, would be a typical size for these guys. Coyotes, prior to wolf reintroduction, was the top dog in the ecosystem. They generally are solitary, except for mother with pups. Really beautiful coyotes compared to what we see here in Southern California, for example, and they can be pretty big. But really, it's the size distinction. Also, the legs are quite a bit shorter than wolves. There's usually no problem distinguishing coyotes from wolves once you've seen a wolf. Also, their gait is a little bit different. But generally no direct conflicts with wolves in terms of feeding on the same kinds of things. Wolves are feeding on elk, they're feeding on bison, they're feeding on big things. Coyotes are feeding on intermediate-sized things. However, wolves hate coyotes, and wolves will run down and kill coyotes, and coyotes have suffered dramatically with reintroduction of the wolf. Not so much because wolf is eating what they used to eat, it's because wolves hate coyotes and they kill coyotes. They don't eat them, they just kill them. And I'll talk more about that in a future module, I hope. So anyway, but there still are quite a few coyotes throughout the ecosystem, and again, they'll be found there year-round, just like the foxes. So the top dog in the ecosystem, of course, is the wolf, and this has also been a very hot political topic in reintroducing the wolf to the ecosystem. And wolves really are spectacular. You may have seen wolves in a zoo, you may see bears in a zoo, but again, I just can't emphasize enough that there's nothing like seeing an animal in the wild, and that's true of wolves as well. And they're pretty oblivious to humans, which is also kind of interesting. You will sometimes see them along the road. I know people that have seen them make kills along the roadside. I haven't quite been that lucky, but I have seen them feeding on a lot of carcasses on the roadside. And again, just primarily have been taking on elk and decimating the elk population and doing a good job of that. It's hard to get close to wolves. I've been lucky enough to get close a few times, haven't really gotten many good pictures, but we usually see wolves way out there, and then that's a reason to have a good spotting scope with you. So as we look at the wolf then in terms of wolf restoration, the wolves were hunted out of the park. Actually, members of the Park Service actually used to kill wolves, and so the last pack was killed in 1926. And then they were listed as endangered in 1974. It took a while to get that listing. And then in 1994, an environmental impact study was completed. By 1995, the reintroduction was well on its way because they wanted to reestablish the intact ecosystem. And one of the driving forces for this was the number of elk. There were just so many elk. They were decimating the aspen forests. And then also, as well, to hopefully exert some control on the growing bison population. So those are the primary justifications. And again, the environmental impact study suggested this was a good way to do it, a natural way to control the elk and bison populations. By 1995, 14 captured wolves were brought in from Canada, and they were brought in because they were feeding on elk. They were specialists on elk. In 1996, 17 more were brought in. Also, there were some pups brought in, and they had some pups as well. And so the population has done extremely well. So wolves have done better than anyone imagined. There have been a lot of lawsuits going back and forth, but they have done extremely well. And they were delisted in 2007. And again, I personally think this is a premature delisting, and I'll talk about that in a second as well. Now, in 2009, they were relisted in Wyoming, and I'll talk about that in a second as well. And it was really because there was a 30% mortality in Wyoming in that first year of delisting, and so a judge put them right back on the list. So when we look at the wolf population and risks to the wolf population and why the numbers fluctuate so dramatically, one is disease. Disease is a big problem. They've had episodes of distemper, viral disease we've talked about before, parvo. Also, they suffer from mange periodically. And also there's a lot of intraspecific aggression at one another. So you'll have one pack taking on another, or alpha males and females being killed in packs, and then that causes a pack to dissociate. So it's very strange. So the population will fluctuate pretty dramatically. You can have large swings in this population, 10, 15%, 20%, 30% changes in a year have occurred. But they also recover quickly, which is also a good thing. And then also, since delisting in Wyoming, they were listed as predators, and so literally people were just stopping and shooting them right off from the roadside. And so anyway, this next picture is a little graphic, so you want to be careful. But anyway, they have shot a lot of wolves up in Wyoming, and for a lot of ranchers, you know, this is a good wolf. Good wolf is a dead wolf. So you have to understand that's an ethic in that particular area. So wolf management then. Again, with delisting came a management plan. And so the idea is that in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, there'll be at least 30 packs and 300 wolves. Idaho and Montana list the wolf as a trophy game animal, meaning that there will be a trophy hunt on those animals, but it helps you regulate the numbers pretty well. Wyoming listed initially the wolf as a predator, and they're holding to that. And so they saw a 30% decline in the first year, and that led to relisting of the wolf as an endangered species, or threatened species at least, in Wyoming. So they are subject to more restrictions than are the agencies in Montana and Idaho. So, you know, bottom line is that the wolf has been successful, but because of the disease problems, because of kind of the ethic in much of the area, they have trouble expanding their range. And this also involves running cattle on public lands. I think that's part of the issue here as well. There have been areas in both Grand Teton Park and around the periphery of Yellowstone Park where leases are granted for running cattle, and that's going to lead to some mortality, although it's way less than anybody had ever predicted. So that really has not been a significant problem. It's more of a straw man argument when people talk about reintroduction of the wolf. But widely successful, and again, I'm very personally concerned about the next few years in terms of that population, but we'll see what happens. Okay, as we look at other families of carnivores in the ecosystem, the cats. There are different cats in the ecosystem. The biggest of the cats would be the mountain lion. So mountain lions are very cryptic. They're rarely seen. I've never seen a mountain lion in that particular ecosystem. I've really just seen one in my life, so they are very cryptic. They're hard to see, but they are around. So any place you have deer, you're going to have mountain lions, and so they are monitored in the area. Primarily regulated through the state agencies. Not very good science behind their regulation. They basically just go by reports. If they have lots of reports of sightings, they crank up the number of hunting licenses. If they don't have lots of reports of sightings, they decrease the numbers. So anyway, not a lot of good oversight there, in my opinion. Bobcats are also found in the ecosystem, also fairly rarely seen, but of course they'll be feeding on smaller animals, birds, wide range of things that they'll feed on. And then also the lynx. Very rare in the ecosystem. Actually, a former student of mine was part of a lynx study, and they did determine that there were at least a few lynx in the park, and so that has led to some management decisions in that ecosystem. But they have very large ranges, and the lynx is more adapted for winter. They have longer rear legs, they have very large paws, and they're very good on snow. So lynx really go after snowshoe hares. So usually with snowshoe hare numbers, lynx go up. When snowshoe hare numbers go down, lynx numbers go down. And again, just a beautiful animal as well, but unfortunately I've never seen one in the wild, and aren't too many up there. Another family of carnivora are the Mustelidae. So the Mustelids, a very large group, includes the skunk. And members of the Mustelidae have anal glands, musk glands associated in the anal area. And the skunk, of course, would be the most dramatic example of that. The striped skunk is the one that we see up there. And, again, pretty much found throughout the United States. Otters are also members of the Mustelidae. We find otters, of course, along the waterways. Generally, I'd say the otters are doing okay. Some decline in the numbers. Coyotes can predate on them. In particular, maybe wolves occasionally when they're going over land, but just a spectacular animal. They can just catch fish at will. They're really fun to watch. Very gregarious and real dynamic little animals. But I would say stable to slightly declining, and numbers here can fluctuate pretty dramatically as well. The pine marten is one that we see pretty frequently up there. It's kind of a large weasel. They'll feed on squirrels. Also, will go after young snowshoe hares. We see those pretty frequently. Wolverine is a rare sighting in the ecosystem. I have been lucky enough to see one wolverine, and that was about 30 years ago. But a very aggressive predator, but quite rare. And they den in some very, very remote locations. So they're just hard to track. They're hard to catch. They like live prey. They don't really feed on carrion too much. So they're hard to study. But studies have shown that there are some wolverines in the area. And a really tremendous predator, aggressive predator. Badgers, pretty common in the area. Again, they'll dig their dens. Also an aggressive predator, feeding on small rodents for the most part. And then weasels. So the short-tailed weasel, also known as the ermine, is found in the area. Occasionally we'll see those. And then another very rare member of the group is the black-footed ferret. And the black-footed ferret is associated with prairie dog colonies, and so the prairie dogs have been reintroduced to the ecosystem. It's kind of a secret location. I don't know exactly where it is, but I have been told by rangers that there is a prairie dog colony in the park and that there are black-footed ferrets there. So I haven't really got official confirmation of that, but I've been told that somewhat unofficially. So I'm curious to know where it is. I'd love to see it, but I haven't been able to do that yet. Okay, other orders that we find in the ecosystem, the Insectivora. There are different types of shrews that we find in the park, and so shrews are largely burrowing animals, but will feed on earthworms and insects and so on. And then rodents. Rodents are really the largest group of mammals in terms of numbers of species and probably numbers of individuals as well. And so there are a number of rodents that we find in the ecosystem. The largest rodent in North America is the beaver. We find beavers all along waterways throughout the ecosystem. They have the broad, flat tail. It's really spectacular to be floating on the Snake River and have beavers accompany you and then slap their tails, and that's as a warning to their young. And they can take down large trees. This is one of the things that actually kills beavers. Beavers feed on vegetation. They'll feed on leaves. They'll feed on bark. But they can take down some extremely large trees. Occasionally, they don't get out of the way and the tree falls on them. As I've talked about before, beavers are somewhat problematic because they also take down trees occasionally that have eagle nests in them or osprey nests in them. And so there have been situations, especially down in the Teton area, where they've actually had to trap beavers and remove them from portions of the Snake River because they've taken down eagle nests. And they also, eagles like to nest in cottonwoods, and then beavers like to eat cottonwoods. So beavers like to build dams across streams. The purpose of that is that it will cause a pond to form behind the dam, and then they can build their lodge in the pond, and then the opening to the lodge will be underwater. So they basically, when they are damming a stream, they're building a moat for their lodge. If they're along a river, they don't really need to dam it because they can build a lodge along the edge of the river, and then again the opening would be underwater. So a predator then has to dig through the lodge to try to get to the animals. Muskrats are also found throughout the ecosystem. They look a lot like beavers when they're swimming, but the muskrat has a rat-like tail, and they're smaller than beavers. They're not nearly as big as beavers. But when they're swimming, again, sometimes people will confuse the two. Porcupines would be another large rodent that we find in the area, pretty frequently seen. They have a real affinity for salt, so sometimes they will be attracted to campgrounds and so on. Years ago, one of them ate one of my friend's boots because his feet were salty, and he was after that salt. And they do climb trees as well. So you'll see bark stripped high up in a tree sometimes, and if you see bark stripped high up in a tree, that's the work of a porcupine. This is a marmot, so there are hoary marmots and yellow-bellied marmots that we see throughout the ecosystem, typically found in talus fields. The red squirrel, also known as the chicory, very common, be chattering all the time. They will store pine cones, and this is how pines get distributed to new areas. Squirrels will hide the pine cones, forget where they are, and then the seeds potentially can germinate there. And there are reportedly flying squirrels. I've never seen them in the park, but they are reportedly there, and I have seen them in Canada. It's one of the really spectacular things. You wouldn't believe the distances that they can glide, and they can actually turn and so on, and they're really extraordinarily beautiful animals, but of course you have to go out in the middle of the night if you want to see them. A golden-mantled ground squirrel, very common sight throughout the ecosystem, again usually around talus fields and some of the higher elevations. The Uinta ground squirrel is the most common ground squirrel that we find in the area. The black-tailed prairie dog, again, has reportedly been reintroduced to the area. And then chipmunk. The least chipmunk is the common chipmunk, and chipmunks are different from ground squirrels in that they have stripes on the face, and that's how you pick them out. And this is an animal that does truly hibernate through the winter, as do a lot of the rodents. And then the pocket gopher, the mountain pocket gopher, is very common throughout the ecosystem, and amazingly is a major food supply, or at least one food supply for the grizzly bear. They will spend hours digging for gophers. It's just really amazing that such a huge animal feeds on such a tiny prey, but they do. And you see a lot of evidence of pocket gophers throughout the park. You'll see these, kind of tunnels, and what happens is that water gets into their tunnels in the winter, and then it freezes and then kind of expands and ends up moving to the surface, and you see evidence of these trails. And then another very small rodent would be the vole, the mountain vole here, and so that's a big part of the food supply. Foxes and coyotes feed pretty extensively on voles. So there are a couple of other orders of eutherians that I want to discuss. The next would be the lagomorphs. Lagomorphs include rabbits and hares. And then also another major group would be the chiropterans. Chiropterans are the bats. So as we've looked at then at the mammals in the Yellowstone ecosystem, I think you get an idea of the incredible diversity of these animals in the ecosystem and all of the different kinds of niches that they fill. So I will be following up with a discussion of lagomorphs, which are similar to rodents, but some distinct differences, and then bats, which again are very cryptic. They're found throughout the ecosystem, but difficult to see, mainly because they're at night and people don't go out at night much. All right, so I'll see you next time.